The morning Fannie Easton arrived in Coldwater Creek, Texas. She had exactly $4.32 in her coin purse, a battered carpetbag that had seen better decades, and a pride so fierce it could have stopped a stampede dead in its tracks. It was the spring of 1878, and the frontier town of Coldwater Creek sat like a stubborn old mule at the edge of the Texas hill country, neither pretty enough to attract settlers nor rough enough to scare them all away. The main street was packed red dirt, lined with a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Rusty Spur, a small church with a lopsided steeple, and a sheriff's office that leaned slightly to the left as if listening for trouble. The air smelled of horses and cedar, and the faint promise of rain that never quite came when it was needed most. Fannie stepped off the stage with her chin high, and her eyes scanning the street with the cool assessment of a woman who had learned the hard way not to show fear in unfamiliar places. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair she pinned up beneath a calico bonnet, gray eyes the color of a winter sky, and hands that were already calloused from years of hard work. She was not the kind of beautiful that stopped men in their tracks on the street, but she was the kind of handsome that made them look twice, and then a third time. Something in the particular way she held herself, straight and careful, like a woman carrying an invisible weight she refused to set down. She had come from San Antonio, where she had been employed as a cook and housekeeper for the Whitmore family for 3 years. The Whitmores had been decent enough employers until old Gerald Whitmore died of a heart ailment in February, and his son, who arrived from back east to settle the estate, informed Fannie with a perfunctory coldness that her services would no longer be required. She had been given 2 weeks' notice and a small severance, which had dwindled considerably on the journey north. She had heard about Coldwater Creek from a woman on the stage, a talkative widow named Mrs. Pruitt who said the town was growing and needed good people. What Mrs. Pruitt had perhaps failed to mention was that a single woman with no family connections and no prospects was going to find Coldwater Creek just as indifferent to her arrival as any other frontier town. Fannie stood in the dusty street with her carpetbag at her feet and took stock. She needed work. She needed a place to sleep. And she needed both within the next day or two before her $4.32 became a matter of genuine alarm rather than merely a quiet one. She had just begun walking toward the general store to inquire about any families who might need a cook when she heard a voice behind her. "You the woman from San Antonio," she turned. The man standing behind her was tall, broad-shouldered, and somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed a razor. He wore the clothes of a working rancher, worn denim and a faded blue shirt, with a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his head as if he had been hurrying somewhere and forgotten to adjust it. His eyes were a warm brown, the kind that could go either serious or laughing in the space of a heartbeat, and just then they were doing both at once in a way that Fannie immediately found suspicious. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Thomas Carson," he said, extending a hand. "I own the Carson spread about 3 miles east of town. I put a notice on the board at the general store. You're looking for cook's work." Fannie had not yet been to the general store. She had not yet seen any notice. She opened her mouth to say precisely that, and then she stopped, because she looked at Thomas Carson more carefully and noticed several things in rapid succession. The first was that his expression was slightly too rehearsed for a man who was simply looking for a cook. The second was that there was a faint, poorly concealed anxiety behind his eyes, as if he was worried she was going to say no before he finished explaining. The third was that he had clearly shaved that morning because there was a small cut on his jaw from a razor, which meant he had made some kind of effort, which was not the behavior of a man who simply needed someone to make his supper. Fannie Easton had spent 3 years cooking for a wealthy family, and a lifetime before that learning to read situations the way other women read scripture, carefully, with an eye for what wasn't being said aloud. She did not let any of this show on her face. "Thomas Carson," she said, and shook his hand with the firm grip her father had taught her when she was 8 years old. "Yes, I am looking for cook's work. I understand you need someone at your spread." Something in Thomas Carson's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, and she thought she saw the ghost of a breath released. "That's right," he said. "I've got 6 ranch hands and I've been doing the cooking myself since March, and I'm about at the end of my rope on that particular matter." Fannie waited a beat. "What happened to your last cook?" she asked, because she was practical, and it was a practical question. "Old Hector Martinez retired," Thomas said, and the answer came a little too smoothly, as if it had been prepared. "He was getting on in years, and his daughter in Austin wanted him closer." "I see," said Fannie. "And your hands, they're in good health?" "No complaints beyond the quality of your cooking." "Nothing a decent biscuit wouldn't fix," Thomas said, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled, and Fannie discovered that Thomas Carson's smile was genuinely and dangerously good. It started at one corner of his mouth and spread like the slow, warm light of a sunrise, and it put a small and entirely unwelcome flutter in her chest that she dealt with by thinking about her $4.32. "What are the terms?" she asked. He named a wage that was fair. More than fair, actually, for a ranch cook. He offered a small private room in the main house, 3 meals a day covered, Sundays with reduced duties. He said it with the air of a man reciting something he had thought about carefully, and Fannie thought again that this man had put considerably more planning into this conversation than someone who simply needed biscuits would have done. She looked at him steadily. "When would you need me to start?" "Today, if you're willing," he said. "The wagon's at the livery. I can take you out this afternoon." Fannie picked up her carpetbag. "Let me put my things in order and I'll meet you at the livery in an hour," she said. She walked toward the general store with her chin still high, and she did not look back, though she was reasonably certain Thomas Carson was watching her go with that same complicated expression of relief and something else she was not yet ready to name. Inside the general store, she found the notice board near the door. There was indeed a notice on it, written in a clear, careful hand that spoke of some education. It said, "Cook wanted. Carson Ranch, 3 miles east. Steady work, fair wages, good accommodations. Inquire at the store or at the livery for T. Carson." The ink was still fresh. The paper was still crisp. The notice had been put up this morning, possibly within the last hour, which meant that Thomas Carson had posted it on the same morning that the stage from San Antonio arrived, and had then very conveniently positioned himself to see who stepped off that stage. Fannie reread the notice once, folded that information away carefully in the back of her mind, the way she folded her best apron, neatly and for later use, and went to buy a small bag of salt and a twist of dried apple for the journey. The Carson Ranch was not what she had expected. She was not sure exactly what she had expected, but what she found when the wagon rolled up the long track between the live oaks was something that felt, underneath its rough exterior, like a place that was trying hard to be something. The main house was a solid 2-story stone structure, the kind that had taken real work and real money to build, with a wide porch and windows that actually had glass in them. The yard was clean and well maintained, the fences in good repair. There were horses in the paddock that were clearly well-kept animals, and the barn was large and organized. 6 ranch hands materialized as the wagon arrived, and Fannie cataloged them quickly. There was old Pete Gruber, who had a white beard and eyes that had been kind for so long they had worn grooves in his face. There was a young man named Eli Rodriguez who looked about 20 and moved with the restless energy of someone who was always slightly late to wherever he was going. There was a quiet, serious man called Jim Ashford, who nodded at Fannie with the kind of grave respect that suggested he had been well raised. 3 others, Davis, Colt, and a taciturn man called Swede who apparently had a Swedish surname nobody could pronounce, completed the group. They were, collectively, delighted to see her. The quality of Thomas Carson's cooking, Fannie gathered from the expressions on their faces, had indeed been a matter of some suffering. Pete Gruber in particular looked at her the way a man in the desert looks at a water barrel. "Ma'am," he said, taking off his hat and pressing it to his chest, You are an answer to prayer." Thomas, standing to one side, said, "Don't exaggerate, Pete." "I'm not exaggerating," Pete said with great dignity. "That thing he made last Tuesday he called a stew, it tasted like something you'd use to patch a fence post." Fannie kept her expression carefully neutral. "I am sure Mr. Carson did his best with what he had available," she said. Thomas gave her a glance she couldn't quite read, and she didn't try to, because she was already walking toward the kitchen. The kitchen was a large, well-equipped room at the back of the house that told Fannie immediately, even before she opened any of the cupboards, that someone cared about it. The cast iron stove was a good one. The shelves were solidly built. The work table in the center was scarred with use but scrubbed clean. The pots were good quality, and though some of the supplies were running low, the pantry was organized in a way that suggested the previous cook, Hector Martinez if he was real, had been methodical and proud of his work. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her hands on her hips and thought that this was actually a very good kitchen, far better than the one she had used for 3 years in San Antonio, and something that had been clenched tight in her chest for weeks began, very slowly, to unclench. She made supper that night from what was available, a proper beef stew with dried chilies and cumin, and a pan of cornbread that came out golden and fragrant, and made Pete Gruber actually close his eyes when he took the first bite. She made a simple apple pudding with the dried apples from her pocket and a bit of sugar and cream, and when she set it on the table, the ranch hands looked at it as if she had performed a minor miracle. Thomas Carson ate quietly at the head of the table, not saying much, and Fannie, who served and then ate at the kitchen table as was customary, listened to the sounds from the dining room and found herself noting that Thomas had not exaggerated even once. He did not crow about having found her. He did not make a performance of the meal. He simply ate, and occasionally she heard him say something quiet to one of the men, and once or twice she heard a general laugh that sounded relaxed and easy, the laughter of men who were comfortable with each other. It was Pete who appeared in the kitchen doorway after supper to thank her properly. "That was the finest meal that's come out of this kitchen since Hector left," he said. "When exactly did Hector leave?" Fannie asked, quite conversationally, while she washed the heavy pot. Pete scratched his beard. "Oh, must be only about 4 weeks back. Though to be fair, the boss never really tried to cook until about a week ago, kept riding into town for meals. It's only been the last week that he's inflicted his cooking on the rest of us. 4 weeks. And Thomas had put up that notice this morning." Fannie scrubbed the pot with great composure and said nothing at all. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Fannie found, to her own guarded surprise, deeply satisfying. She rose before dawn to start the fire and have breakfast ready for the hands before they went out, a proper breakfast with eggs and salt pork and biscuits and strong coffee. She cooked the midday meal for herself and Thomas if he was in, as the hands ate out on the range, and she prepared supper every evening for the whole company. In between, she kept the kitchen and the downstairs rooms of the house in order, baked bread twice a week, and put up preserves when Thomas brought back crates of summer fruit from town. She was a very good cook. She knew it without vanity because she had always worked hard at the things she did, and cooking was one of them. She could make something good out of nearly nothing, and when given decent materials, she produced food that was more than just sustenance. The ranch hands ate with the devotion of converts. Thomas never said very much at the table, but he was always there for supper, which Fannie began to notice was not an entirely consistent thing for a man who ran a working ranch, because there were evenings when she could hear from the window that there was still plenty of work being done in the yard and the barn, and yet at supper time Thomas Carson was always washed and seated at the table. He did, however, linger in the kitchen in the mornings. It started innocently enough. The first morning after she arrived, she had been alone in the kitchen at first light, and he had appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, and asked if there was coffee yet. She had handed him a cup, and he had stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard, and they had been quiet together, which was not an uncomfortable quiet but a working quiet, the silence of two people who are separately productive in the same space. By the end of the first week, he was appearing every morning, and the coffee was ready because she had come to expect him. He began talking during those morning sessions, not about much at first: the weather, the condition of the grazing, whether the creek was running well. But gradually, the conversations grew in the way that conversations do when two people are actually listening to each other, like a plant growing toward light. She learned that Thomas Carson had come to Texas from Missouri at the age of 22, following an older brother who had since returned east to marry a girl their mother approved of. She learned that he had built the stone house himself with the help of two men, and that it had taken 3 years. She learned that he read, which she had suspected from the books she found on a shelf in the parlor, and that he had a particular fondness for anything historical, and that he had opinions about Frederick the Great that he expressed with a mild but genuine animation that she found charming against her will. In return, and only gradually, because she had not spoken easily about herself in a long time, she told him that she had grown up in Missouri herself, in the Boothiel country, the daughter of a Methodist preacher and his wife who had died of fever when Fannie was 15. She told him that after her father followed her mother in death 3 years later, she had gone to work wherever work was offered, that she had cooked in a boarding house in Springfield, and then for a hotel in Dallas before the Whitmores, that she was not a woman who was accustomed to uncertainty, but that she had made a practice of meeting it head-on regardless. Thomas listened to all of this with his coffee cup in both hands and his brown eyes steady on her face, and he never looked at her the way some men looked at a woman who was telling them about hardship, with a kind of uncomfortable pity that was more about their own discomfort than anything else. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is genuinely interested in and thinking about carefully. One morning in the 3rd week, she was making biscuit dough when he came in, and instead of taking his coffee to the window as usual, he sat down at the kitchen table. "You don't have to stay in the kitchen for this conversation," she said, with her hands in the flour, because she had begun to be comfortable enough with him to be slightly wry. "I know," he said, and that was all, and he sat there with his coffee, and she worked her dough, and the mockingbird outside the window was carrying on as it always did in the early morning, and it was one of the nicest hours she could remember in a long time, which alarmed her considerably. She had been keeping herself strictly in the position of employee because that was what she was, and because she was a sensible woman who did not confuse pleasant mornings in a warm kitchen for anything more substantial than what they were. But Thomas Carson had a way of making it difficult to maintain that sensible distance, not through any inappropriate forward behavior. He was unfailingly respectful, but through the quieter and more subversive method of simply being a man she liked talking to. He was funny when he wasn't trying to be, which was her favorite kind of funny. He was direct without being blunt. He had an eye for detail that showed up unexpectedly, as when he noticed that she had rearranged the pantry shelves and said nothing about it except to mention, a day later, that he'd been able to find the lard without looking for 5 minutes, which he said as if it were a significant life improvement. He was kind to the ranch hands without being soft about it, and she had seen him on 2 occasions go out of his way for someone who could do nothing for him in return. He also, she noticed in the 4th week, had a perfectly adequate ranch with 6 capable hands, and no visible reason that he could not have simply increased Pete Gruber's duties slightly to cover the cooking, until he found someone at a more leisurely pace. She turned this over in her mind the way you turn something over in your hands to examine it from all sides, and she arrived at the same conclusion each time, which was that Thomas Carson had not genuinely needed a cook urgently. He had needed a reason. The question of what he had needed a reason for was one she was not yet answering directly, even to herself, but it sat there in her chest next to the warmth she was firmly not acknowledging, and she addressed it instead by making an exceptional supper of roasted pork with dried cherry sauce and sweet potato that made even the taciturn Swede look approving. It was Eli Rodriguez who complicated things, with the perfect thoughtlessness of a 20-year-old who had no idea he was doing it. He appeared in the kitchen one evening in the fifth week while the other hands were on the porch and Thomas had ridden out to check the south fence, and he leaned in the doorway with the ease of a young man who was comfortable in most places and said, "Miss Fannie, can I ask you something personal?" "You may ask," she said, which was different from saying she would answer. "Do you know that the boss came into town 4 times in the 2 weeks before he put up that cook notice?" Fannie continued stirring the pot. "Is that so? And that every time he came in, he went and stood in front of the stage office and then came back without doing whatever he'd come to do?" "Eli," she said with great patience and deliberate mildness, "would you like to fetch the butter from the cold larder, or would you prefer to stand in that doorway and tell me things I already know?" There was a silence. Then Eli said, "You already know." "The butter," Fannie said, "if you please." Eli fetched the butter with a grin that she studiously did not see. The thing was that Thomas was doing the same, she realized. He had figured out, somewhere in the past 5 weeks, that she knew his notice was newer than it should have been for a man who'd been cooking badly for a week. She was almost certain of it because she had seen the small shifts in his behavior, the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking, not with concealment or calculation, but with something that was almost rueful, as if he was having an internal conversation about the same subject she was having an internal conversation about, and finding it equally complicated. They had arrived, without discussing it at all, at a kind of mutual and wordless agreement to go on pretending. He pretended to need a cook. She pretended not to know he was pretending. And they both kept pretending with the elaborate care of 2 people who understand that some things are grown in silence and cannot be rushed without ruining them. It might have gone on indefinitely, except that September brought trouble from outside the comfortable fiction they had constructed. His name was Walter Greer, and he was the owner of a large cattle outfit 20 miles south called the Double Bar G, and he arrived one Thursday morning with 2 of his men while Thomas was out on the range, and Fannie was in the kitchen making bread. She heard the horses in the yard and came to the kitchen window. Walter Greer was a heavy-set man of about 50, red-faced and prosperous-looking, with the manner of someone who had been important for long enough that he had stopped noticing when he was being rude. He looked around the yard with a proprietary air that made Fannie dislike him before he opened his mouth. He asked for Thomas. Jim Ashford, who was near the barn, told him Thomas was expected back by noon. Greer looked at his watch with irritation and said he would wait, and he dismounted and walked up onto the porch of Thomas's house as if it were already his own, which told Fannie several things at once. She brought out coffee and cornbread without being asked, because she was a cook and that was what you did, and also because she wanted to hear what Walter Greer said when he thought no one important was listening. He was polite to her in the absent, slightly dismissive way of a man who did not count working women as significant. He ate the cornbread with appetite and commented to his men that at least Carson kept a decent kitchen. He talked freely about his plans to expand, about the water rights on the creek that ran between the Double Bar G and the Carson Ranch, about how it would make sense, real practical sense, for a spread like Thomas's to fold itself into a larger operation. He was not subtle about what he meant. He meant Thomas's land. He meant the creek. Thomas rode in at 11:30, and Fannie watched from the kitchen window as he saw Greer on his porch, and something in his face went carefully still, not hostile, but measuring, the expression of a man who has just recognized a chess move being made against him and is calculating the response. She could not hear the whole conversation from the kitchen, but she heard enough. Greer wanted the water rights to the upper stretch of the creek. He framed it as a business proposition, mutually beneficial, but the frame was thin, and Thomas clearly saw through it as easily as Fannie had. She heard Thomas say, in a calm and pleasant voice that had no warmth in it whatsoever, that he would think about it. After Greer left, Thomas came to the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and Fannie, who was punching down the bread dough with perhaps slightly more force than was strictly necessary, said, "He's going to come back." "Yes," Thomas said. "Is there a legal question about the water rights?" "No," Thomas said. "The rights are mine, recorded with the county. Greer knows it. What he's hoping is that I'll find it easier to sell than to fight." Fannie thought about this while she shaped the loaves. "Will he make it difficult for you?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "He's not above it," he said finally. "He's been pushing out smaller spreads for 3 years, but I'm not a small spread and I'm not going anywhere." The way he said it, quiet and certain, without bluster, made Fannie look up at him, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not about Walter Greer at all, and she looked back down at her bread dough and said, "There's apple cake for supper. It will be ready by the time you've washed up." Thomas said, "Thank you, Fannie." And the way he said her name, not Miss Easton, just Fannie, the way he had been saying it for weeks, sat in the air between them like a warm hand extended but not yet taken. Greer came back the following Thursday, and then again the Thursday after that. Each time Thomas was polite and unmoved and said nothing that was a yes. Each time Greer became incrementally less polite and marginally more pointed. His men, the 2 who came with him, began to have a habit of lingering in town and saying things in the rusty spur that were designed to be unsettling. Talk of water disputes going badly for the wrong party, that kind of thing. Eli brought these reports back from town and delivered them to Thomas with the indignation of a young man who took loyalty seriously. And Thomas listened and thanked him and did nothing precipitous, which Fannie thought showed good judgment. What she didn't expect was the evening in mid-October when she went out to the small garden she had started at the side of the house to gather the last of the fall herbs, and found one of Greer's men leaning against the fence, not threateningly exactly, but ostentatiously, in the manner of someone who has been placed there to be noticed. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said something that was designed to be unpleasant without being actionable. Something about how it was a shame for a woman to be working in a place that had uncertain prospects. Fannie straightened to her full height, which was not especially imposing but which she used effectively, and said, in the voice she had once used to quiet a dining room full of unruly Whitmore guests, "You are standing on private property, and I suggest you remove yourself before Mr. Carson comes home." The man removed himself, but she went inside with a feeling that things were moving toward some kind of reckoning, and that it would be better to be prepared. That evening after supper she stayed in the kitchen later than usual, and Thomas, who had been reading in the parlor, appeared in the doorway at 9:30. "You're still up," he said. "I am," she said. She was not going to pretend the man by the fence hadn't happened, because she thought Thomas ought to know. She told him, plainly and without dramatizing it, what had occurred. Thomas's expression as he listened to her went through several things in quick succession: the careful stillness she had seen before, and then something that was genuinely angry, and then something that was concerned in a way that had nothing to do with the property dispute and everything to do with the fact that she had been the one standing in that garden alone. "I'm sorry," he said when she finished. "That should not have happened." "I can handle myself," Fannie said, which was true and not really the point. "I know you can," Thomas said, which was the right answer, and the concern in his face didn't go away, which was the thing she kept thinking about afterward. "Thomas," she said, because she had dropped the Mr. Carson in the second week without quite deciding to, "what are you going to do about Greer?" "I'm going to send a letter to the county seat in the morning confirming the water rights and registering a formal complaint about the harassment," he said. "And I'm going to have a conversation with Sheriff Denton." "Good," Fannie said. "And I'm going to ask you to be careful when you go out to the garden alone," he said, looking at her with that direct brown gaze. "Not because you can't handle yourself, but because I would rather nothing happen to you." The kitchen was very warm from the stove and very quiet, and Fannie was acutely aware of how close they were standing, which was not improper in itself. This was a working kitchen and not a drawing room, but it felt, suddenly, like the kind of proximity that wanted to mean something. She stepped back half a step and said, with composure she was moderately proud of, I'll be careful. Now you should go to bed. You have an early start tomorrow. He went. But at the door he paused and said without turning, Fannie, I'm glad you're here. She stood in the kitchen after he left and listened to his footsteps on the stairs, and she thought that they had been pretending for 2 months, and the pretending was becoming more work by the day, and she was not sure how much longer either of them could sustain it, which made her feel simultaneously terrified, and underneath the terror, like someone who is standing at the very edge of a high dive, with the whole shimmering water below. The situation with Greer resolved itself, as Thomas had anticipated it would, through legal channels. The county seat confirmed the water rights. Sheriff Denton, who was a practical man of 50 named Hal Denton, and who appeared to have a low personal opinion of Walter Greer's methods, paid a visit to the double bargee that had some visible effect. Greer's men stopped appearing near the Carson ranch fence. Greer himself came one final time in late October, and the conversation he had with Thomas on the porch was brief and apparently conclusive, because he left without the casual proprietary air he'd had before and didn't come back. Thomas told Fannie about it the next morning in the kitchen while she made breakfast. He was matter-of-fact about it. He said the legal foundation was solid and Greer was a bully but not a fool. He said Pete had given him the idea of registering the formal complaint, and he said it with a slight sideways grin that suggested Pete deserved some credit. He was not entirely sure Pete would like publicized. Fannie poured his coffee and said, "Good," and meant it deeply. November came in cold and brilliant, with skies the color of blue enamel over the hill country and the cedar and oak going gold at the edges. The ranch settled into its winter rhythm, with the hands rotating indoor and outdoor work, and the kitchen became the warmest and most social room in the house, the place people gravitated toward in the afternoons when the outside work was done. Fannie found, somewhat to her surprise, that she was happy. It was a careful, provisional kind of happiness, the kind she had learned not to trust too completely, but it was real. She was good at her work and the work was appreciated. She was comfortable in her room, which she had made her own with small, careful touches, a cloth on the table, a sprig of dried rosemary hung by the window, her father's Bible on the shelf. She had a community of sorts in Pete and Eli and Jim and the others. And she had the mornings. The mornings with Thomas had become something she looked forward to with an honesty she could no longer entirely suppress. He was, she had decided, one of the most genuinely interesting people she had ever encountered, which was a thing she had not expected from a Texas cattle rancher, though she recognized immediately that the expectation had been unfair. He talked about history and about the grasslands and about the political questions of the day with the same engaged thoughtfulness. He listened to her opinions and did not condescend to them. He was exactly as interested in what she had to say as he was in what he had to say, which in Fannie's experience was not as common as it should have been. She had also noticed, in the careful inventory she kept without admitting she was keeping it, that he was a man of genuine character. He was fair to his hands in a time and place where fairness was not always a given. He paid honest wages. He did not cheat. He had told her once simply that his father had taught him that a man's reputation was built on how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him, and she had thought about that sentence for days afterward. It was Pete Gruber who finally said it aloud, the way Pete Gruber said most things aloud, with the comfortable directness of a man who had lived long enough not to see the point in circling what he meant. He came into the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in November when Fannie was making pie, and he sat down at the table with his coffee and watched her for a while and then said, "You know, it occurs to me that the boss hasn't been to town on a Saturday in 2 months." Fannie fitted the top crust over the pie with care. "Is that unusual?" "Used to go every Saturday," Pete said. Said it was to take care of business, but we all knew it was because the ranch on Saturdays was, and I say this with respect, somewhat quiet for a man who likes company. Fannie pressed the edge of the crust with her thumb. "I expect he goes when he needs to." I expect, Pete said, that he finds he doesn't need to as much as he used to. He paused. He's a good man, Miss Fannie. I've worked for him 6 years. Best man I've worked for. And before you ask, no, I'm not saying this because he pays me. I'm saying this because it happens to be true and because I am too old to say things that aren't true to spare anyone's feelings. Fannie looked up from the pie at Pete's kind, weathered face. I know he's a good man, Pete, she said quietly. Pete nodded as if something had been confirmed. He drank his coffee. He did not push further, which she appreciated. He was a man who knew when he had said enough. That evening Thomas asked her, while they were alone in the kitchen after supper, if she would like to come into town with him the following Saturday. He said there was a church social in the evening, nothing elaborate, just the town getting together before the cold settled in properly, and he said she might enjoy getting off the ranch for an afternoon. He said it with a careful ease that she recognized as exactly the tone she used when she was trying to sound less invested in something than she was. I would like that, she said, matching his tone with care. Good, he said, and then, as if he couldn't quite help it, he smiled, the sunrise smile, and she looked at the kitchen table with great attention and thought about the fact that she was 24 years old and had more sense than this. Saturday was cold and clear. Thomas drove the wagon himself, having sent Pete and Eli ahead earlier in the day on some ranch errand that Fannie was 90% certain he had invented, and so they drove to Coldwater Creek with the whole wide sky above them and the cedar-scented air. And Thomas talked about the history of the hill country, and she talked about a book on botanical medicine she had been reading, and the 3 miles passed without either of them seeming to want them to end. The town was livelier than usual for the social. The church hall had been swept and decorated with autumn branches, and Mrs. Hattie Pruitt, who organized most of the town's social events with the focused energy of a military campaign, had arranged tables of food and a fiddle player who sat up in the corner and played with considerable enthusiasm, if not always perfect accuracy. Thomas introduced her to people with a naturalness that made her wonder briefly what exactly he was introducing her as. He said, "This is Fannie Easton. She's at the ranch," which was true and was also not quite specific about what she was at the ranch, and several people exchanged looks that Fannie clocked and stored away. She met the sheriff, Hal Denton, who was a compact, direct-eyed man who shook her hand and said he'd heard good things about her cooking, which was both a compliment and a testament to how freely information moved in a small town. She met the minister, Reverend Cobb, who was a serious young man from Ohio who appeared to be still adjusting to Texas with some difficulty. She met a woman named Clara Hutchins who ran the boarding house and who was sharp and funny and immediately interesting, and they talked for 20 minutes about the respective challenges of cooking for large groups of people with wildly varying preferences. Through all of this, she was aware of Thomas. He moved around the room talking to people, and every so often she would find his eyes, because he was apparently doing the same thing, aware of her across the room. And each time their eyes met there was a split second of something that was not neutral and not accidental before one of them looked away. He brought her coffee and then later a plate of gingerbread that someone had contributed, and when he gave her the plate their fingers touched briefly, and neither of them commented on it and both of them noticed. On the way home in the dark wagon with the stars overhead in their millions, they were quiet for a while, and then Thomas said, "Did you enjoy this evening?" "Very much," Fannie said. "Clara Hutchins is wonderful. I hope I see her again." "She comes out this way occasionally," Thomas said. "She and Pete have been friends for 30 years. Fannie turned to look at him in the dark. "Pete and Clara Hutchins." "Don't mention it to Pete," Thomas said with that sideways amusement. "He turns extremely red." Fannie laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere warm, and she felt Thomas look at her when she laughed. And she let herself just be there in the cold air and the dark and the stars, for just a moment, before she got herself back in order. "Fannie," Thomas said, as they turned up the track to the ranch, and something in his voice was different now, Not the easy conversational tone, but something that had come forward from somewhere more considered. "Yes," she said. There was a pause that lasted long enough to matter. "I'm glad you came to Coldwater Creek," he said. It was what he'd said before, or close to it. "I'm glad you're here," but it was somehow different this time. Less like a statement and more like the beginning of something longer that he was working up to, and Fannie felt the high dive feeling again, the shimmering water below. She said carefully, "I am glad I came." The wagon rolled to a stop in the yard. Thomas climbed down and came around to help her down, which she could have managed fine alone but did not refuse, and his hands were at her waist to steady her. And when she stood on the ground they were very close again, and the air between them was doing that thing it sometimes did now, becoming a separate and charged medium. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was not ambiguous at all, that was actually quite entirely readable to any person with functioning eyes and a working knowledge of how people looked when they were afraid to say what they felt. She said, very quietly, "Thomas." He said, "Fannie, I have a confession to make." She waited. "I didn't urgently need a cook," he said, and the words came out with a careful deliberateness, like a man stepping onto uncertain ice and deciding the risk is worth it. "I mean to say I could have managed. I would not have managed well and the men would have suffered, but I could have managed. And I should tell you that because I don't want anything between us to start with something that wasn't honest." The yard was silent around them. The horses moved in the paddock. Somewhere an owl spoke to the dark. Fannie said, "I know," he blinked, "you know." "The notice was freshly posted the morning I arrived," she said, with a composure that was betrayed slightly by the fact that her hands were not entirely steady. "And you happened to be at the stage office. And Pete told me, perfectly accidentally, that you'd only been cooking for a week. And Eli told me you'd come into town several times to look at the stage and gone home without doing whatever you'd come to do." Thomas stared at her. "You've known since the first day." "Since approximately the first afternoon," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said in a slightly different tone, "And you came anyway." "I needed work," she said, which was true. And then, because she owed him the same honesty he had just offered her, she said, "And I wanted to see if my first impression of you was correct." "Was it?" he asked. "It was," she said, "considerably more correct than I found comfortable." Thomas looked at her in the starlight, and his expression was something she had not seen on his face before, unguarded and open and warm in a way that made her chest feel too small for what was in it. "I noticed you stepping off the stage," he said, "and I knew I had exactly one reasonable chance to speak to you before you walked down that street and into some other life, and I took it, and I am not sorry about it." "You could have simply introduced yourself," she said. "If I had simply introduced myself," he said, "you would have said it was a pleasure to meet me and walked on, and I would have spent the next 6 months trying to find a reason to see you again." This was probably accurate. Fannie acknowledged it by not arguing with it. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "That I knew you knew and that I was, and I say this without embarrassment because I think it is true, considerably better at running a cattle ranch than I am at telling a woman that I think about her every morning, and that the prospect of this kitchen without you in it is one I find genuinely unwelcome." Fannie breathed once carefully. "Thomas," she said. "I know this is complicated," he said. "You work for me, and I should have addressed that before now, and if you want me to make other arrangements for the cooking, I will, and you can stay on in whatever capacity or go, if that's what you want. I needed you to know, because we've been pretending for long enough and I find I'm done with pretending." She looked at him for a long moment. The pretending, the whole careful, elaborate construction of it, had been serving them both as a kind of shelter. And he was right, they were both done with it, had been done with it for some time. And what was on the other side of it was standing right here in the dark yard of the Carson ranch under a sky full of uncountable stars. "Thomas," Fannie said for the third time, and then she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the one with the small old scar from the razor, and his entire expression changed at the touch, went soft and certain all at once, and she said, "I think about you every morning too." He put his hand over hers where it rested on his face, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm briefly, and it was the most tender and precise gesture she had ever experienced from another person. And then he looked at her and said, "Can I call on you, properly, not as your employer?" "You can call on me," she said. "Properly." He smiled. "The sunrise one." She let herself look at it this time without looking away. That night in her room, she sat on the edge of her bed and held her own hand in the dark, the hand he had pressed his lips to, and she thought about Coldwater Creek and the stage and $4.32, and she thought that life was a very strange and occasionally generous thing. The weeks that followed were a different kind of warmth than what had come before, something that was allowed now instead of carefully contained, and the allowing of it changed the texture of every day. Thomas came to the kitchen in the mornings as he always had, but now there were moments that were not the practical currency of conversation, a hand that lingered at her elbow when he passed, a look exchanged over the heads of the ranch hands at supper that had the quality of a private language. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons, lending her a steady gray mare named Pearl, who turned out to be an excellent horse and a fine companion, and they rode out across the ranch and into the cedars, and Thomas showed her the spring that was the head of the creek, and the old live oak with the lightning scar that he used as his landmark for the south boundary, and the hill that he had climbed on his first day on this land, and from which he had decided that this was where he was going to build his life. They talked, as they had always talked, about everything and nothing, and the talking was a pleasure that sat alongside the growing other pleasure of simply being near each other, without requiring constant justification. He told her once, on a Sunday in December with the air cold and the cedar bright green against the pale sky, that he had never found it easy to talk to people, that he tended toward quiet in company, but that with her the quiet and the talking were both comfortable, and she understood that this was something he was telling her carefully, and she received it carefully. She told him in return about the loneliness that had been her companion since her mother died, how she had learned to fill it with work and had sometimes mistaken busy for happy. She said it matter-of-factly because it was matter-of-fact. It was her life and she had made peace with the harder parts of it. But Thomas heard the true weight of it and said nothing immediately, just rode quietly beside her for a moment, and then reached over and took her hand where it rested on the saddle. He held it for a moment and then let go, and the gesture was small and exact, and said everything she needed it to say. Christmas at the Carson ranch was lively and warm. Pete, who had a considerable culinary competence that he had never bothered to reveal while Thomas was doing the cooking, helped Fannie with the Christmas baking with the reverent attention of a man who considered the production of good food a sacred undertaking. They made pies and cookies and a proper pudding, and the hands contributed a bottle of good whiskey from a saloon in Austin that someone had brought back from a cattle drive in the fall, and Thomas produced a bottle of brandy from somewhere in the house, and Clara Hutchins came out from town with Reverend Cobb and half a dozen townspeople, and the house was full of people and noise and light. Fannie had put pine branches along the mantel and on the window ledges, and the whole house smelled of pine and spice and wood smoke, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the crowded, bright parlor and felt the thing that she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, the feeling of being home. Thomas found her there. He came and stood beside her and they both looked at the room, and he said quietly, "Merry Christmas, Fannie." She leaned briefly and with intention so that her shoulder rested against his arm. "Merry Christmas, Thomas," she said. Pete, catching sight of this from across the room, appeared to be extremely satisfied with the state of the universe, and went to find another piece of pie. January was cold and demanding, and the ranch work was unrelenting, but there was a contained and steady joy to those weeks that Fannie had not known she was missing. She was useful, and she knew it, and she was valued, and she knew that too. And there was Thomas, solid and warm and genuinely interested in her in a way that she was learning, slowly, and with the careful trust of someone who had been self-reliant for a long time, to let matter to her. He asked her to marry him on a January evening when the temperature had dropped to near freezing and they were in the parlor after supper, she with her mending and he with his book, in the comfortable habit of two people who had shared space long enough to be natural in it together. He said it simply. He put down his book and looked at her and said, "Fannie, I'd like to marry you, if you're willing." She set down her mending. She looked at him across the room, this man who had pretended to need a cook and had turned out to need something else entirely, this man who had listened to her and ridden beside her and pressed his lips to her hand in the dark yard and had never once made her feel small. "I am willing," she said. "Very willing, Thomas." He crossed the room in 3 steps and sat beside her on the settee and took both her hands in his, and she felt the warmth of his hands around hers, and thought that it was extraordinary what could come of stepping off a stage in a strange town with $4.32. "I would like to do this properly," he said. "With the Reverend and with notice so Clara can bring a cake." "Clara will be very pleased," Fannie said. "Clara has been telling me since November that I was taking too long," Thomas said, with the rueful expression of a man who has been receiving unasked-for advice. "She told me the same thing in December," Fannie said. They looked at each other and then both laughed, and the laughter broke the formality of the moment, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat in the warm parlor with the fire going, and the cold outside and the whole future arranged ahead of them, close enough to touch. They were married in March of 1879, a full year after Fannie had stepped off the stage in Coldwater Creek. Reverend Cobb performed the ceremony in the church with the lopsided steeple, which someone had straightened over the winter and which now stood properly upright, as if preparing for the occasion. Clara Hutchins brought the cake, a magnificent 3-layer construction with white frosting that she had apparently planned in secret for 4 months, and which provoked from Pete Gruber an expression of such helpless admiration that Clara told him afterward with some asperity that it was just a cake, at which point Pete said it was the finest thing he had ever seen in his life, which was not entirely about the cake. All 6 of the ranch hands came in their best clothes, which in Eli's case meant a new shirt that he had clearly bought specifically for the occasion, and which was slightly too large in the shoulders but extremely well-intentioned. Hal Denton the sheriff came with his wife, a small capable woman named Ruth who shook Fannie's hand with the warmth of someone who was genuinely glad to have her in the community. Half the town came, because the town was not large, and this was the nicest thing that had happened in it in some time. Fannie wore a dress of deep blue wool that Clara had helped her make, with her hair pinned up beneath a small hat and the garnet earrings that had belonged to her mother, the only thing she still had from home. Thomas wore his good suit, which fit him well, and he stood at the front of the church with the look of a man who is holding himself very carefully because he is feeling more than he knows what to do with. And when she walked up the aisle and he saw her, that care broke open for a moment into something naked and certain, and so unguarded that she had to look away briefly because the directness of it made her eyes sting. She recovered herself by the time she reached him, and she looked up at his face and thought that she would remember this particular moment, the specific quality of the light in that church in March 1879, for the rest of her life. "Ready?" he said, very quietly, just for her. "More than ready," she said, and meant it with everything in her. They said the words to each other that the Reverend directed them to say, and they meant the words, both of them, in the way that people mean things when they have come through enough uncertainty to know the value of certainty. Thomas put a ring on her finger that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band, and she felt the weight of it settle onto her hand with the solidity of something that was exactly right. When the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Thomas put his hands at her face gently and kissed her with the same care and intention with which he did everything. And from behind them came the sound of Pete Gruber applauding with a forcefulness that the rest of the congregation, after a half-second, joined. The reception in the church hall was warm and loud, and full of good food that Clara and Fannie and Ruth Denton had organized with the efficiency of a small military campaign. The fiddle player from the autumn social came back and this time played rather better, and there was dancing, and Thomas danced with Fannie with the careful concentration of a man who is making an honest effort at something he is not naturally gifted at but refuses to do badly. "You are working very hard at this," she said, close to his ear, because she was honest with him. "I am determined not to step on your feet," he said, equally honestly. "You have stepped on my left foot twice." "I know." "I apologize. I am committed to the remaining dances being flawless." She laughed against his shoulder and he held her a little closer, and they danced with somewhat less technical accuracy and considerably more feeling, which was, she thought, the right resolution. The spring brought real change to the Carson ranch, the kind that happened from the inside. Fannie rearranged the house with Thomas's enthusiastic agreement. Not the kitchen, which was already right, but the parlor and the upstairs rooms, making the house feel like a home that two people had decided together rather than one that happened to have a second person in it. She planted a proper kitchen garden in the cleared space at the south side of the house, and Thomas built her the garden fence she asked for without being asked twice. She put up curtains in the parlor windows, real curtains with some color in them, and Thomas stood back and looked at them and said they made the room look like a place someone actually lived in, which was the best compliment she could have wanted. She continued to cook, because she was a cook and it was her work and she was good at it, and she had no intention of stopping. What changed was only the nature of the context. She was no longer the cook at the Carson ranch. She was the mistress of it and also its cook, which was a different thing and felt different in her body when she stood in that kitchen, this kitchen that was hers now. Summer brought a discovery that changed things again. She told Thomas on a June morning in the kitchen, quietly and directly, because that was how she was with him now, without ceremony or anxious build-up, simply the fact of it, which was that she was expecting a child. Thomas looked at her for a moment across the kitchen table where the coffee was still hot between them, and then he stood up and came around the table and wrapped his arms around her from behind, very carefully, as if she might be different now, slightly fragile, which she was not and would tell him so very soon but would allow for this moment. And he pressed his face against her hair and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I am so glad." She put her hands over his where they rested at her waist. "So am I," she said. He told Pete that evening, because he told Pete most things, and Pete cried, which he did by turning away and blowing his nose very loudly, and then turning back with an expression of great dignity, and saying he had something in his eye. Eli congratulated Thomas with the enthusiasm of a 20-year-old who found everything excellent, and Jim Ashford shook Thomas's hand with a gravity that suggested he took this as seriously as he took everything. The rest of the hands were variously pleased and awkward in the way of men who are not sure of the right response but want to make one. Clara Hutchins came out from town when she heard, which was approximately 6 hours after Thomas told Pete, because information in Coldwater Creek traveled at the speed of a very determined breeze, and she arrived with a bolt of soft flannel cloth and a look of immense satisfaction. The pregnancy was not easy in its early months, and Fannie did not pretend otherwise because she was not a woman who pretended with Thomas, not about anything important, not anymore. She was sick most mornings through the summer, and tired in a way that she found both physically exhausting and mildly insulting, as she had always had a robust constitution, and the idea of being rendered fragile by her own body was not one she adjusted to without protest. Thomas took over the early morning kitchen duties without discussion, which meant the hands had coffee and passable scrambled eggs every morning, and an expression of gentle suffering that they manfully concealed. He did not hover over Fannie, which she would have found intolerable, but he was consistently, quietly present, and she found that the right kind of presence was not hovering at all. By October she felt like herself again, just a larger version, and she reasserted her kitchen with considerable pleasure, and took the cooking back from Thomas with a firmness that sent him to the barn with a visible relief that she chose to find amusing rather than offensive. Their son was born in January of 1880, in the bedroom of the stone house, with Clara Hutchins acting as midwife because she had considerable practical experience and Ruth Denton's steady assistance. It was a long night and a hard one, and Thomas sat outside the bedroom door with Pete for company, and Pete told him stories about the old days on the range that were not even slightly relevant to the situation, but which filled the silence in a way that was kind. The baby was born just before dawn, and he was healthy and loud about it, and Clara opened the bedroom door and told Thomas he could come in, and he came in and looked at Fannie, who was exhausted and pale and completely triumphant, and then he looked at the bundle in her arms, a red-faced, dark-haired, furiously alive small person, and sat down on the edge of the bed because his knees had done something unreliable. "A boy," Fannie said, looking at him with that smile he had not seen before this particular version, soft and dazzled. "A healthy boy." Thomas put out one finger and the baby gripped it with an authority that seemed disproportionate to his 2 minutes of existence, and Thomas looked at Fannie over the baby's head and was clearly not going to say anything for a while because he did not trust his voice. "Thomas," Fannie said gently. He swallowed. "He's perfect," he said, which was not, Fannie thought, entirely objectively accurate as newborns went, but was perfectly accurate in every way that mattered. They named him James Henry Carson, for Fannie's father James and Thomas's father Henry, and from the first morning of his life, he was Pete Gruber's devoted subject and Pete was his devoted servant, and the two of them spent a remarkable amount of time together over the following years in a relationship of mutual regard that was one of the great friendships of James Carson's early life. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because no life is, and the frontier in the early 1880s had its own particular set of demands. There were dry seasons and wet ones, a cattle illness in the spring of 1882 that cost them 20 head and some genuine financial anxiety, before Thomas renegotiated a contract with a buyer in San Antonio, and things stabilized. There was the matter of a disputed fence line with a neighbor to the north that took 2 years to sort out through the courts, and that Fannie and Thomas discussed at length in the kitchen in the evenings, with maps on the table and strong opinions shared freely between them. There was Eli Rodriguez leaving in the spring of 1881 to take up a claim of his own further west, which was the right thing for Eli, and which still left a gap in the daily life of the ranch that took some time to fill. He came back to visit twice a year, and brought his young wife Alina the second time, a quiet woman from a ranching family in New Mexico, and Fannie and Alina recognized each other immediately as women of the same practical and capable sort, and became correspondents. Pete stayed. Pete would have stayed through an earthquake if Thomas and Fannie had stayed. He was part of the ranch the way the stone walls were part of it, foundational and weathered and reliable. His friendship with Clara Hutchins continued in its complicated way, full of things said indirectly and things not said at all, and Fannie, who had become one of Clara's closest friends, occasionally offered Clara pointed and unsolicited observations about the nature of stubbornness, which Clara received with a dignified silence that conveyed how little she wanted Fannie's opinion, even as her eyes said she was listening to every word. It was Thomas who finally told Pete, in the fall of 1882, that he was an old fool who was letting something good go to waste by being proud about it, which Thomas delivered with the directness of a man who had his own strong feelings about not letting pride get in the way of what you actually wanted. Pete turned extremely red and said it was none of Thomas's business, and Thomas agreed and said it wasn't, but he'd said it anyway. And 6 weeks later Pete went to town and asked Clara Hutchins if she would like to have supper with him, and Clara said yes with a composure that suggested she had been waiting for approximately 4 years. Their second child came in the winter of 1882, a daughter this time, born in early December when the cedar outside the bedroom window was silvered with frost. They named her Rose, after nothing in particular except that she seemed, from her very first moments, like a rose, a soft, fierce combination of things that suggested she would be her own considerable person. James, who was nearly 3, received his sister with the uncertain dignity of a small person who is not sure whether he approves of a new development, but is prepared to monitor the situation. Rose turned out, by the time she was walking, to be extremely fast, extremely curious, and extremely interested in the horses, which had not been the case with James, who was more interested in Pete's stories and in the books that were beginning to accumulate on the parlor shelves as Fannie ordered from the catalog in San Antonio. Rose would be found at the fence of the paddock at any available opportunity, studying the horses with an intensity that Thomas watched with a look of recognition that suggested he found it both delightful and mildly inconvenient to have produced such a child. The stone house grew along with the family, not literally. The stones remained where they were, but in the way that houses grow when they are lived in by people who love each other, filling up with the accumulated evidence of shared time, the scarred kitchen table that had been there when Fannie arrived, and on which James had been set at the age of 6 months, and looked at his mother with enormous eyes and grabbed her braid with his fist. The parlor shelves that had started with Thomas's history books and now included Fannie's botanicals and James's collections of rocks, and a small stack of novels that Thomas read as diligently as he read Frederick the Great and the history of Texas. The garden, Fannie's garden at the south side of the house, grew into something substantial over the years, a proper kitchen garden with herbs and vegetables, and a small section she had given over to flowers, which Thomas had initially regarded as a luxury and had come to regard as a pleasure, particularly in the spring when the whole south side of the house was in color. She thought sometimes about arriving in Coldwater Creek with $4.32 and a carpetbag, and she thought about the man who had been standing at the stage office with a freshly posted notice and an expression of determined hope, and she thought that life was very strange and very good, in the way that things are good when they have been honestly arrived at. Thomas knew that she thought about this because she had told him as she told him most things, and he had said that he thought about it too, about standing at that stage office and seeing her step down with her chin in the air and her carpetbag, and thinking that he had exactly one chance and he'd better not waste it. Was it the chin? She asked once because she had always wanted to know. The chin was part of it, he said seriously. Also the way you looked at the town, like you were assessing it and finding it arguable but not impossible. Arguable but not impossible, Fannie repeated. That is also how I would describe my assessment of you on that first morning. And now? Thomas said. Fannie looked at him across the kitchen table where they were sitting after the children were in bed, the familiar warm kitchen, her kitchen, with the firelight and the smell of the bread she'd baked that afternoon still in the air. Now, she said, I find you entirely necessary. Thomas smiled, the sunrise one, the one she had never in 5 years tired of or grown accustomed to in the way that would make it less than what it was. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she felt the warmth of it the way she had felt it on that first morning in the cold yard, present and certain, the weight of someone real. By the spring of 1884, Coldwater Creek had grown considerably. A new school had been built at the eastern end of town, which Fannie had campaigned for at every town meeting for 2 years, and which James, at 4.5, regarded with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that Fannie thought was fair. A second general store had opened. The Rusty Spur had been joined by a more respectable hotel with a dining room that was doing steady business. The population had doubled since 1878, bringing new families and new energy, and a sense that the town was becoming something. Fannie had become, in those years, a central figure in the women's community of Coldwater Creek in a way that had happened naturally rather than by design. She was practical and direct, and she organized well, and she did not condescend to anyone, and people responded to that by trusting her with things they wanted done and done properly. She had been part of getting the school built and getting a proper doctor to settle in town, a Dr. Samuel Holt who had come from Philadelphia and was still adjusting to Texas with the bewildered fortitude of a man who is determined to make it work. She had also, carefully and over time, begun to speak about things she thought were unjust, about the treatment of the Mexican families who had been in this country long before most of the Anglo settlers and who were consistently given the rough end of most arrangements, about the Comanche situation, which had been resolved in the decade before by methods that she would say plainly were not methods she was proud of as someone who lived on this land. She said these things in the particular way she said difficult things, clearly and without shrillness, which meant people listened even when they were uncomfortable, and sometimes things shifted a small amount, which was the most that could be asked of any one person in any one place. Thomas supported her in this entirely and told her so, and also told her when he thought she was being heard, and when he thought she was working against herself, because that was the nature of the partnership they had built, honest and mutual and occasionally pointed. Clara Hutchins married Pete Gruber in October of 1884, in the same church with the now properly upright steeple, and Fannie made the cake herself, a magnificent 4-layer construction with white frosting and small sugar roses, and Pete looked at it with the expression of a man who is helplessly moved by beautiful things, and said it was the finest thing he had ever seen in his life. Clara, who was standing beside him and had heard this before in reference to food products, said, "That is becoming your signature compliment, Peter," and Pete turned and looked at her and said, "You're the finest thing I've ever seen in my life." And Clara, who was not given to being flustered, went slightly pink, which Fannie witnessed from the kitchen doorway with profound satisfaction. James Carson went to school in the fall of 1884 and took to it with an enthusiasm that Fannie had suspected he would, given the way he had been reaching for books since he was large enough to pull them off the lower shelves. He was a quiet, serious child who found things deeply interesting and communicated this with a precision that made his teachers either delighted or slightly overwhelmed, depending on the teacher. He wanted to know about everything, and Fannie and Thomas fed this carefully and completely, because they both believed that a mind that wanted to know things was the most valuable thing a person could have. Rose went to school 2 years later with considerably more social ambition than her brother and an interest in every person she encountered that won her immediate friends and occasional enemies, which she navigated with a pragmatic adaptability that Thomas recognized as coming from her mother and said so. And Fannie said that adaptability was a survival skill, and she hoped Rose would always have it. And Thomas said she would. He was certain of it. Their third child came in 1885, another boy born in August when the hill country was at its most golden and fierce, and they named him William, after no one in particular except that it suited him, and he arrived in the world with the full-throated confidence of a youngest child who was going to make himself known. James, who was 6, received his new brother with the measured consideration of someone who was already working out the implications. Rose, who was 3, decided William was hers and attempted from his first week to manage his schedule, which did not succeed but which set the tone for the relationship they would have for the rest of their lives. The ranch by 1886 was flourishing in the way that things flourish when they are well run and well loved. The herd had grown. 2 new hands had joined, a pair of brothers from Colorado named Fisher who were hardworking and good-humored, and became part of the household in the way that the Carson ranch tended to absorb people. Jim Ashford, who had been on the ranch since before Fannie arrived, had become the foreman in everything but name, and Thomas and he worked together with the ease of 2 people who had spent enough time in the same endeavor to understand each other without needing many words. Pete, who was now living in town with Clara but came out to the ranch 4 days a week because he could not stay away from it and Thomas would not have wanted him to, had become a kind of institution, the person who remembered everything and who was the living memory of the place. He told William, when William was old enough to listen, about the day Miss Fannie stepped off the stage, and he told it with the relish of a man who had witnessed a great moment and knew it, and was not going to stop being pleased about it. "Pete," Fannie said, when she caught him telling this story for what was probably the 15th time to William and 2 of the neighbors' children who were visiting, "you embellish that story more every time." "Miss Fannie," Pete said with great dignity, "I have never embellished a fact in my life. I simply make sure all the important parts are properly heard." "In your version," Fannie said, "I apparently stepped off the stage and the whole town stopped." "The important parts of the town did," Pete said serenely, and William laughed and Fannie shook her head and went back to the kitchen with the smile she was trying not to show. Thomas found her in the kitchen a few minutes later, because he usually found her in the kitchen eventually. It was still the gravitational center of the house after all these years. He came and leaned against the worktable beside her in the way he had developed of being next to her without being in her way, a specific skill she had come to appreciate enormously. "Pete's at it again," he said. "I know," she said. "He's told William that you ran across the stage yard to be the first person to speak to me." "I walked briskly," Thomas said. "He makes it sound like a pursuit." "It was," Thomas said very simply, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and 8 years of marriage and 3 children and 1 good ranch and this kitchen between them, and his expression had that quality it sometimes had of being exactly what it was, unperformed, just true. She stopped what she was doing and she put her hand on his face in the way she had on that first night in the yard when the pretending ended, and he turned his face slightly into her hand as he always did, a habit so old now it was like breathing. "I'm glad you walked briskly," she said. He covered her hand with his, warm and sure. "So am I," he said, "every day." Outside the kitchen window, the Texas hill country was green and enormous under a spring sky, and the horses were moving in the paddock and James was reading under the live oak with his back against the bark, and Rose was attempting to instruct William in some game of her own invention that he was resisting with the stubbornness of a 2-year-old. And Pete's voice carried from the porch where he was still telling the story of the day Miss Fannie arrived, getting better and larger with each telling. Inside the kitchen, which smelled of bread and wood smoke, and the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling that Fannie had put up 3 springs ago, Thomas Carson held his wife's hand and she held his, and the whole life they had made was around them and ahead of them, unambiguous and solid and full, the truest kind of home, the kind that is built not from stones alone but from the accumulated weight of choosing each other, every day, past the pretending and the uncertainty and the careful distances. All the way down to the simple and sufficient truth of this. The story of the cook's notice on the board at the general store became a legend in Coldwater Creek over the years, the sort of story that towns keep and polish because it says something true about how things begin, not always with great dramatic declaration, but sometimes with one person pretending to need something they don't quite need and another person pretending not to notice the pretending. And both of them meeting each other in that gracious fiction until they are close enough that the fiction is no longer necessary. Their children grew up knowing the story. James told it at his own wedding in 1901 to a woman named Margaret Price who found it. She said, the most sensible love story she had ever heard, which James thought was the right response, and which made Thomas and Fannie look at each other across the room with the private smile of people who understand the joke from the inside. Rose retold it to everyone she ever met, with Pete-like embellishments of her own invention, until it had acquired a luminosity that somewhat exceeded the facts and completely captured the truth. William, who was quiet in the way of youngest children who have grown up listening to others tell everything, kept the version that was simply his parents in the kitchen in the morning with the coffee and the bread, the way they were, the particular quality of the space between them that he had grown up inside of, and that he could not have described, but that he carried with him the way he carried everything that mattered, without show, entirely. Thomas Carson died in the spring of 1917, at the age of 71, in the house he had built with his own hands from hill country stone, in the bedroom that looked out over the garden. He had been ill through the winter with the sort of illness that comes at the end of a long and full life, and that is not dramatic, just slow. And Fannie had been beside him through all of it with the same steady presence that had been the constant of his life for 38 years. His last morning was a March morning, cold and clear, and the mockingbird was going in the live oak outside, and Fannie sat beside him and held his hand, and they talked a little, not about important things but about the horses and about James's youngest who had visited at Christmas and about the mockingbird, which Thomas had always liked, and then they were quiet for a while. He looked at her and she looked at him, and she saw in his face something that was peace, the peace of a man who has been given everything he needed and given it well. And he said her name once, just Fannie, in the way he had always said it, and then he was gone, gently, like a light that has been burning a long time completing itself. She sat with him in the quiet for a while, with the mockingbird outside and the spring coming in over the cedar hills, and she held his hand in both of hers the way he had held hers in the dark yard on that first night, and she thought of all the mornings, all the 1,000 mornings in this kitchen, all the Sundays on the horses, all the children and the seasons and the good ordinary weight of a life built with someone you loved well. And she was not undone by grief, because grief was the correct price of what she had been given, and she had always been a woman who paid what she owed with her whole heart. She outlived him by 11 years, living in the stone house with James and his family who took over the ranch, still in the kitchen she had claimed as her own in the fall of 1878, still making bread twice a week, and still growing her herbs in the garden at the south side of the house where the sun was best. She told the story herself, sometimes, to her grandchildren and to their friends, and she told it simply, without Pete's embellishments, just as it had been, the stage and the dusty street and the man with the freshly posted notice and the eyes that were doing more than one thing at once. She said it had started with pretending, both of them at it, him pretending to need what he actually needed for a different reason, and her pretending not to see through it because she was interested enough to let it play out, and that the pretending had been a kind of grace, a shelter they had built together while they were figuring out the thing underneath. And she said that the thing underneath, the real thing that the pretending was protecting while it grew, had been as good and as solid and as lasting as the stone house on the hill, which was still standing, and which had been built to last, by someone who knew what he wanted and was not afraid to go and get it. She said this in the kitchen, at the scarred and familiar table, with the spring light coming through the curtain she had put up in 1879 and the smell of bread in the air, and she said it to whoever was there to hear it, and every time she said it she meant it more completely, which is the way the truest things work, becoming more true the longer you carry them. The mockingbird was always singing somewhere. The cedar hills were always green, and the kitchen was always warm. That was all. That was everything. That was enough.